Hey guys, so our group is covering sociolinguistics and pragmatics. As a quick refresher, sociolinguistics is the study of how language and social factors such as ethnicity, social class, age, gender, and education are related. While sociolinguistics deals more with dialects, social identity, and things like code switching, pragmatics focuses on the effect which context has on language's meaning. Pragmatics can relate to factors which are similar to those that concern sociolinguistics, but pragmatics seeks to understand language on a narrower scale, in which varied meanings of words themselves are investigated. While completely different, both topics prompt an investigation of the ways in which languages interact with different factors and evolve in a modern setting, which is essentially just the focus of our presentation. So our group primarily focused on 3 articles which explore the ideas I just mentioned. The first was a study on the ways in which young people in Germany react to LGBTQ representation over time. The study found that people were more open to this kind of representation and inclusion if the topic was discussed between members of the youth. The study makes a clear distinction between the ways that different members of the community interact and share information with each other. Although not explicitly referenced, the study touches on the idea of face, which was mentioned in the textbook. The data reflects that youth expressed positive face as they tended to spread an inclusive mentality, which reflected a desire to gain the approval of peers. Specifically, the study found that a larger percentage of the youth actively supported the inclusion of LGBTQ identities in school curriculums, and that conversations amongst youth contributed to a trend of greater openness in the community as a whole over time. So there was a positive trend that they discovered. The opposition to this progress came in the form of the church's involvement in the community. Many church leaders and members disapproved of LGBTQ representation in school curriculum as they tended to interpret the meaning of this effort as one of indoctrination, given that it was kind of a government initiative and that the government had a role in implementing this change. This brings to mind the idea of negative face, in which the church-aligned members of the community are reacting against what they perceived as an imposition of a state agenda or beliefs on themselves as individuals. This article especially interested us because of the question at the center of the study, which is, should school curriculums include a greater amount of representation of LGBTQ identities? So although the source is a study of reactions over time and kind of like a simulation of that, what prompted the study was an effort to include more transgender and non-cisgender pronouns and identities in school curriculums, just like as subjects in math problems specifically. And this is a perfect example of a pragmatic question as we consider how non-binary pronouns like they, which in this case is a singular pronoun, have been altered by the social context and setting, which would be, discussions between youth in a school setting or even, under a more progressive government. And so you kind of see this shift away from its original form as a collective pronoun to a new singular personal pronoun. And just considering the effect that community has on speech, from that source, now we can kind of move towards our next source, which is titled Black Women Talking, and it deals with sociolinguistics and code switching extensively. So relating to the idea of effect of community on speech, Harris, the writer of the article, says that when the pair of Black women are professionals, their co-constructed talk is imbued with the multiple, often conflicting roles they inhabit simultaneously. The code switching required to exist daily in both Black and white communities, and the contradiction between their own self-concept and stereotypical public perception is kind of, that's the end of the quote, but that's kind of something that we were really interested in. We had a lot of discussions about as a group on this topic, and it really jump-started, more conversations about the perception of AAVE, which is African American Vernacular English, as a non-professional language, which is kind of how it's portrayed in a lot of these settings. And as Josh kind of points out, the regulation of Black speech, as in AAVE, as a non-professional language or dialect, is indicative of a larger social problem. He says that it indicates a society's unwillingness to accept the subjectivity of a group of people. And in terms of sociolinguistics, the researcher highlighted this as a problem because, in her words, according to the Linguistic Society of America, languages are a matter of socio-political construction. For instance, there are many examples of speech forms from 2 different groups that may be considered mutually intelligible, but are called different languages, and not dialects of the same language, which she gives the example of like Swedish and Norwegian, because there's a lot of overlap in those 2 languages. So therefore, African Americans in the United States have the power to declare our language a language. And I think that's a really valid argument. And I don't really know how you can contest that. But as our group discussed, the fact of AAVE's duality is exactly the qualification of its validity as a language. We discuss how the article investigates this duality, as the author says, quote, language use simultaneously binds professional Black women to their communities and distances them from it. We saw this as a reason that AAVE should be recognized as a language, because this recognition would remedy the need for people of color and African Americans to worry about accommodating a single, elevated, idolized language in their code switching. If there was a greater freedom in their code switching and a greater acceptance of different languages and codes within that, there wouldn't be this question of non-professionalism. So now we're kind of seeing how community affects language in another way, and I just want to switch gears and talk about how language affects community. So in our third source, we found research on Old Norse, what are called loan words, present in modern Irish and Gaelic language, which were left over from the Viking Age, when a lot of Scandinavian people were kind of settling in Ireland and Scotland. So let's see, like the hybridized language which many modern African Americans use, modern Irish and Gaelic utilizes a number of slightly altered words borrowed from the Old Norse language. This is interesting because the hybrid dialect started as a way for identifying and referring to the Scandinavian people settling in new lands, as well as their tools, buildings, food, and other possessions. Adapting their language to include ways of identifying and distinguishing themselves from their Scandinavian neighbors quickly resulted in a new dialect which permeated every facet of language, even how the Irish and Scottish people themselves referred to themselves and their others. Like, they specifically talk about how the word for neighbor in these dialects is derived from Old Norse, and it's changed slightly, but you can still see the evidence of the original word. So, I mean, they're literally like identifying the things around them with borrowed language. And so, as the superstrate of the Irish and Gaelic languages dominated Scandinavian settlers, a backwards diffusion occurred in which the Old Norse substrate was able to carry over a set of several hundred crucial words. In other words, in a modern setting, there is no longer a language which is strictly Norse or Irish or Gaelic, but rather a nativization of the hybrid dialects has occurred. So that was just really interesting to me because it talks about, let me see, I have it somewhere. It talks about the prestige dialect, which is a hybrid of both the Norse words and the Irish and Gaelic. So, you know, there's kind of this idea of the language of power being multicultural, and I thought that was really interesting in relation to our discussions on AAVE. Let me just make sure, 1 second. So while in this oral presentation we only touched on a few of the more interesting discoveries, there are a few more included in our PowerPoint and many more in our respective term papers. Although finding relevant and contemporary sources was hard, as I'm sure it was for a lot of people, we managed to encounter some really interesting and exciting material, which kind of has this optimistic vision for the future of language. If these sources are any indication, it would seem that we are on kind of the cusp of an explosion of language, kind of because we're seeing these unprecedented hybridized and diversified languages, which is really cool, especially considering like the technological advancements and integration in recent times. And we were also talking just about how the research in the course itself were conducted in a virtual setting, kind of in a setting which promotes multicultural engagement. So it was just kind of really interesting to consider how, this research or even these discussions might not have been previously possible, but now we're able to look back centuries ago and kind of see how language is evolving and use that as a tool to evolve language ourselves. So we were kind of discussing how we think there is this sort of shift happening in language. It's changing, there's slang words in the dictionary. So, we were really interested to look at these articles and these sources and just get like kind of a scholarly perspective on it. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, you can always email any of us, or I think you'll be able to comment on our projects and our feedback too. So I'll be checking out for those. So will Josh and Lisa, just to answer any questions you guys might have. And if anybody wants to see like our term papers too, we can always send you those. Have a good day. Thanks.